Cathaoirleach, and I want to, on behalf of the Social Democrats, I want to welcome this motion and thank Deputy O'Brien for bringing it forward. I think it complements the motion that the Social Democrats were bringing forward in the morning on the vacant homes tax, where we're looking for a vacant homes tax with teeth. Really, the derisory 0.3% that the government have brought forward is not going to be an effective tax, will not unlock the potential of vacant homes that we have, more than 100,000 across the country. And I think it does signify how, even with the open goal of vacant homes, and the lack of seriousness on that, that we're not seeing the kind of response that we should be, the seriousness from a whole government approach on this. I do want to say, about a year ago, the Minister was unequivocal that 2022 would be the year of delivery. He was very clear on that it would be the year that he was going to meet his housing targets, and he was very clear with us that he would meet the targets in terms of social, affordable, cost rental homes. So it's deeply disappointing that we are now 3 years in a row that this government has failed to meet those targets. And what's a real kick in the teeth for people is that that's happening at the very same time that money is left unspent in the region of €1 billion in capital funding from the housing budget that could have and should have been spent on building homes. Out of the 4,100 affordable cost rental homes promised for 2022, that figure is far too low. The Minister for himself, in the last general election, promised just 10,000 affordable homes a year was the promise, but only 4,100 were promised last year. But out of that, we only got 1,007 affordable purchase and cost rental homes, and out of those, only 323 are actually affordable purchase. That's hugely disappointing in terms of the promises that were made, but also in terms of the huge need there is there for affordable homes. We have, under this government, we've reached record levels of homelessness, record rents, record house prices, and record numbers of people in their 20s and 30s and even into their 40s still living in their childhood bedrooms. Adults living in their childhood bedrooms who want to be able to move on in life, have an independent life. They want to be able to return and visit their childhood homes, return and visit their parents. And they're having this prolonged period where increasing numbers are then saying it's the only option for me to become independent. We're talking about people in good, well-paid jobs here who've done everything right, who've gone, put themselves through education, people who have often worked very hard to get themselves through college in terms of part-time work, and then years later, having done everything right, got their qualifications, gotten a good job, are still stuck in their childhood bedrooms. And they're asking, is the only way I can get out of this is that I have to emigrate? And then we're losing people, of course, with skills that we desperately need, especially across society and across our economy, especially though in areas like healthcare, education. We all know through our constituency work we'd all be dealing with parents who can't get the services that they need for their children with disabilities, with additional needs, because the frontline staff that are being trained here cannot be retained. We cannot fill posts because we're losing them because there isn't, partially because there isn't affordable housing. The €1 billion that the government has failed to spend, it's worth asking ourselves, Cathaoirleach, what could have been done with that in terms of housing. Now, if you think about it, in terms of most affordable homes and most social homes are built with an upfront subsidy of somewhere between 50,000 to 100,000 euros. The Minister knows the rest of the funding typically, if it's a social home, typically will come in through loans, loan finance that is then paid off over time. If you think about that, even if you base it on 100,000 euro being the full cost of that subsidy, the upper end for a social or affordable home, from that €1 billion we could have had 10,000 homes built that people could be living in now. And if you think of the incredible impact that would have on people's lives, in terms of getting families who are under pressure out of the private rent sector, who are worried about evictions, getting them out of the private rent sector, getting families out of homeless emergency accommodation, and getting the very huge numbers of people into their 20s and 30s in their childhood bedrooms, out of those childhood bedrooms into housing that could have had and should have had, if the government had met its targets, had used the funding it allocated itself to provide housing. If they'd done that, we could have such a better outcome for people right now. I think most people here expect that the government should be moving absolute heaven and earth on housing to ensure that more housing that's affordable that people can move into is built, and that we get thriving, cohesive, sustainable communities with that. Instead, we read this week about the Land Development Agency turning down multiple sites that were offered by state agencies for affordable housing. In Limerick, for example, 16 different sites that the LDA was offered for affordable housing turned down by the Land Development Agency. Now, if the government was meeting its targets on affordable housing, was spending its allocations, then we may, that may not be as serious. But given that you are so far off meeting your targets on affordable purchase housing, how is it that the Land Development Agency is turning down so many sites for affordable housing? The Cathaoirleach, there's been mention this evening of gaslighting, and I have to say, I think the Minister boasting about selling public land to private developers to build predominantly expensive private housing, I think that's a form of gaslighting, to be quite frank. And I think the predecessors that the Minister has in Fianna Fáil from the 50s, 60s, 70s would really be aghast at this. 1950s Ireland was a very dark place for a huge amount of people in this country. But one thing we can say about the 1950s and 60s and 70s is that not only was our public land not sold to private developers, actually the state and local authorities was CPOing land at scale to build public housing. In my constituency alone, Cathaoirleach, in areas like Artane, Edenmore, Kilbarrack, Coolock, a huge amount of public land was CPO'd by the local authority to build public housing rather than land sold off to private developers. And when you look at the mix on those lands, about 90% of those lands that were CPO'd were affordable and social homes, with about 10% private housing provided on those lands. And that was the kind of mix that was gone for, and it was effective in terms of delivering homes that people could actually afford. And I constantly meet people who moved into those homes and will tell you the success that they and their families were able to have by having somewhere secure to live, and somewhere that their families could thrive in. I was talking to a lady just last night who was able to tell me about the social home she got in one of those public lands that was CPO'd from private owner when they were able to move in about 50 odd years ago, and she was able to tell me with real pride about how well her now grown-up children have done and the contribution that they're making to this country, to our public services and to our private sector, because they had such a good grounding with their housing and were able to then use that as a good foundation for their education and for what they've contributed in life. I think missing from this in terms of how could a government miss targets and leave money unspent like that? I think missing from this is a real realisation of the huge importance of home. It's not just bricks and mortar, it is where relationships are built, it's where newborn babies are brought home into, it's where family celebrations are held, it's where people live and thrive, and where they make friends in their communities for life, get stuck into their communities, into their GA club and into the youth clubs and into the senior citizens and boards of schools. It's where people spend their final years in their homes. And all of that foundation that people have is being taken away from people who cannot move out of their parents' home while they're in their adult years, or people who are living in the private rent sector and in constant fear of eviction and are paying some of the highest rents in Europe with some of the lowest levels of security. So I would implore the government, we cannot afford next year to be back here with missed targets and unspent money again. We need to do everything we can to ensure that the targets are met, homes are delivered, and that the money that's allocated for housing is spent in its entirety. Curve